Office here at HUD headquarters, and I wanted to welcome you to our second session of the Train the Trainer series. And this week we are going to focus on rental assistance and leasing standards in the CoC program. You're going to be in for quite a treat. This is going to be quite an intensive session, and we're really excited that you're a part of our session with us. Quickly, I wanted to just let you all know that we had promised in our first session that the questions that we had, we wanted to actually review the questions from session 1. But due to the Thanksgiving holiday and some other pressing priorities in our office, Susanna and I haven't had a chance to review everything. But we did actually nail down whether or not the HQS inspector actually needed to be certified. And we consulted with our colleagues in PIH, and we did determine that the HQS inspector did not need to be certified. There are no requirements in the Section 8 program for that, so accordingly in our program there's no requirement for the HQS inspector to be certified. So wanted to clarify that, but hopefully on the session on December the 20th, that session isn't quite as dense as the first 2 sessions have been, and Suzanne and I hope to actually have a written listing of all of the questions that are outstanding, have that written for you all, and have an opportunity to discuss those answers at that time. So right now I think I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Well, actually, this is Jill Spangler first, and I want to welcome you first and let you know that I will be sending out the language for the HQS inspection this afternoon after this, so you'll have that in writing. I want to welcome you today. Our presenters are Emily Cooper and Liz Stewart at TAC, and our resource advisors from HUD are Tiffany Moore and Susanna Limon. The session is scheduled to last until 12:30 Eastern Time. Participant phones are on mute until we'll break for questions. We will have an audio recording of this session as well as the last. We had promised the last time that we would email you the recording, but the file is too large. So instead we will post them both on SharePoint. A reminder that these materials are all for internal use in helping us as TA providers understand. They're not to be shared or used for TA purposes. In terms of submitting questions, we'll be taking questions throughout the session. If you'll use you'll submit them through the questions function on the GoToWebinar toolbar, which is on the right of your screen. The presenters will pause periodically to answer and discuss the questions, and when that happens, Natalie Matthews will unmute your phone so you can ask the question live. We will also be collecting the questions as we go and keeping track. If you are somebody who's listening to the webinar through your telephone, you can be unmuted and that will work fine. But if you're listening in through your computer, you won't be able to be unmuted, and so you'll have to do the questions through the, you'll have to type in your questions instead. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Emily and welcome you to the presentation.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Tiffany. Hello again, everybody. Happy Friday morning. You get to listen to my voice and Liz's voice for the next couple of hours again. We'll try and make it as exciting as possible. Just a few housekeeping things. I just want to make sure that when you are listening to this, that you have either printed out in color or are reviewing on screen the PowerPoints that we are using because of 2 things. One is that, as with last time, there are areas in blue that are areas that are still under consideration, are still necessitating further guidance from HUD. The other reason is that the notes section have a lot of information in addition to the slides, so printing it out with the notes would be really helpful. So today, last session we focused on components and costs, so you're now experts on that. And this time we're going to drill down specifically on rental assistance and leasing as eligible costs under the Continuum of Care program. We're focusing on those 2 areas specifically because they are the most complex areas, and I think an area where we get a fair amount of questions through the help desk and through the startup trainings. We do, however, just as an aside, often get feedback when we spend a lot of time on rental assistance and leasing saying, what about us SSOs? We have unique issues, or those projects with operating. So those projects are just as important, but today we're going to focus on these two areas. And as you can see, we have about, over 100 slides on this, so it is a very complicated and dense thing. We will be skipping over, however, the basics. There is an assumption that, one, because you heard last week or 2 weeks ago the session on components and costs, that everything in there you're an expert on. Two, that you've done your homework and have read the reading and resource list and the required readings and are up to speed. And three, that in participating in this, that you're advanced in the program anyway. So there are slides we're going to say, you guys already know this, and they just sort of set the stage, and we're going to skip over. So what are we trying to impart today? First is to talk about the requirements for projects with rental assistance funds and leasing. Some of these requirements are not new, but it's really the first time they've been clarified. So we're going to look at some of the key changes, but some of the things that weren't changes but might have been news to some of the programs that are just figured out that they were out of compliance for all these years. And then we're going to really highlight some of the questions that have come up. Again, these slides were developed with input from all the startup trainings, from the AAQ, and from other areas from the regional teams of questions that have come up over time. So these are the areas of the rule that we're specifically covering, and these were the prior reading assignments. Just to be clear, the rent reasonableness and fair market rent under the CoC program is not a HUD-approved document. It is something that was drafted based on the ESG document. It reads almost exactly the same, but with tweaks for it for the continuum of care program. But it's really the ESG document on rent reasonableness and ESG was really the best rent reasonableness document I've ever seen, actually, that it really was easy to mirror it into the CoC program. So it's something that you should, that's of the reading assignments, I'd start with that one because I think it's pretty helpful. So we're going to use a lot of terms today. I'm assuming you remember BLI, budget line item, and components and costs and all those things. But today we're going to talk about gross rent, and we're going to talk about contract rent. So the gross rent is the total cost of the rent plus the utilities. And the contract rent is the amount the landlord gets. So that may or may not equal the gross rent. So if utilities are included in the rent, then the contract rent equals the gross rent. And if utilities are not included in the rent, then the contract rent is less than the gross rent. So I know that sounds a little bit like Charlie Brown's parents. So the example is, let's say rent is $500. Utilities are $50. So the gross rent is $550. And if you were all, if this was interactive, I would say, what is the contract rent then? The contract rent is $500. If utilities were included, then the gross rent and the contract rent would be equal. So those are just things to keep in mind because we're going to spend a lot of time on rent and a lot of time on utilities, and it'll be important later. As we're talking about these programs, I think you should be aware of what kind of projects are transitioning. So in general, and again, there's allowances made for every project being individual, but in general, shelter plus care programs, when they transition to the CoC program, will be a permanent housing PSH component, and it'll have long-term rental assistance, and it may have support services or HMIS or project admin as budget line items. SHP transitional housing, depending on the characteristics of the program, could have stayed transitional housing component or actually could have gone to permanent housing rapid rehousing. And in that case, they could have leasing or rental assistance or operating, but you can't mix operating and rental assistance in the same unit. So that would, you just need to keep that in mind. Support services, HMIS, admin. SHP permanent housing, you would probably become a PSH component, and an SSO in most cases would become an SSO. There are some SSOs, just to let you know, that have leasing funds. But these are, in general, how folks would transition. And part of the transition is also just to keep in mind that every project's unique and you can't combine certain costs in the same unit or structure, so that may mean for different budget line items. But in general, Shelter Plus Care transitions to a permanent housing, permanent supportive housing project with rental assistance funds. Having said that, however, the guidance actually was, it really depended on the project's characteristics, and that you were allowed to transition from leasing to rental assistance. And you could do that only the first time an SHP project with leasing funds was transitioning to the Continuum of Care program. So it started last year. Those people who didn't take advantage of it last year but could have are not eligible to change again. Like they had a one-time shot of transitioning and they didn't transition. So this year, it's all the people who are up for renewal, all the SHP projects with leasing funds that are up for renewal for the first time have the option of transitioning to a rental assistance project. But let me be clear, it's based on what they're already doing. This isn't an opportunity to change the current project. It's a chance to look at the current project and say, how does it fit? How can we continue to do what we're doing given the rules and regs of the Continuum of Care program? So we're going to talk basically today about all of these characteristics. So this is what a rental assistance project would look like. You know, the lease is between certain people. There's a written agreement and who pays rent. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these characteristics because that's what the rest of the session is about. We're going to talk to you about leases. We're going to talk to you about who pays rent with who owns the units, how you calculate the rental assistance subsidy, who needs to administer the rental assistance, who can you use the money for vacancies, etc., what the match is. Leasing requirement, and then there's characteristics of the leasing project. So you would stay a leasing project depending on who's on the lease, depending on if there's an occupancy agreement, who pays rent to whom, whether or not you're charging people a fee or an occupancy charge, or whether or not you can pay a vacancy payment, and whether or not there's match. So we're going to talk about all these things. But just to let you know, there is an opportunity to transition, and actually folks are going through that right now, through the Continuum of Care application, through the grant inventory worksheet, based on the characteristics of the program. So we're going to talk about rental assistance first. So rental assistance is, as you know, because you're all experts now, is an eligible cost under PSH, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, homelessness prevention. We are not going to talk about homelessness prevention in this session. Maybe in the future we'll have one specifically for homelessness prevention. There are 3 different models of rental assistance. In the past, these were called components, and there are actually 4 different components. So we're going to talk about the 3 models of rental assistance, and then I'll tell you what to do about the 4th. So there's tenant-based rental assistance. You should already know this. So I'm not going to spend time on it. Oops, excuse me. There are some limitations. You can dictate where people live. You can require people to live in a specific area for the entire period of participation, or in a specific structure for the first year, and a specific area for the remainder of the period of participation. This was true in Shelter Plus Care as well. So it's not a new concept. In transitional housing, you can also require people to live in a specific structure. So this is true for any project with tenant-based rental assistance, including rapid rehousing, transitional housing projects, or PSH. And this is up to the recipient or sub-recipient to decide if this policy is something they want to implement. It is optional. You can put some limitations on where people reside. Some things to keep in mind with tenant-based rental assistance is that right now there is a requirement that people use CoC-funded assistance within the CoC's geographic area, except for people who are need to move to ensure their safety if they're a victim of domestic violence. I think there's a question of how that gets operationalized for the domestic violence exception, but I don't want to skip over the fact that many continuums have not been leasing up in just their geographic area. So this is an issue for a lot of continuums, particularly in metropolitan areas where you had a city was one continuum and a county was another continuum. So they've forged these relationships where tenant-based rental assistance has leased up anywhere in the county, even though it was a city's tenant-based rental assistance through their continuum. So that's going to come up a lot, and I think, as TA providers, we may just want to think about how we help people deal with the fact that they probably have a smaller pool of landlords, that they have a smaller pool of apartments that they would be working with, and what does that mean for their project overall? Does that mean they can't serve as many people? Does that mean they have to look at different models, or or they have to do different landlord outreach? So that's just something to keep in mind. Sponsor-based rental assistance is not a new model. It is basically where the recipient contracts with a sponsor, which is a nonprofit agency that goes and then rents an apartment in the community from a private landlord, and then subleases the unit to a program participant. You guys should be familiar with this model, but there are some differences between this and leasing. Because if you're on the ground looking at a project document and they describe to you how the lease works and how the rent works, you could say, well, I don't know if that's a leasing project or a sponsor-based rental assistance project. And they look and smell exactly the same. So the differences are not often in how they operate. The differences may be in how they're funded or what budget line items they have. So for example, rental assistance uses a formula to calculate how much the rental assistance there is. So it's the fair market rent times the number of units times the length of time, and it's a basic formula. So when you apply to HUD, you apply based on the formula. Whereas leasing, and you'll hear about this later, leasing, you just ask for the dollars that you want, based on some assumptions of your average FMR, your average apartment, but it's not a calculation. In rental assistance, recipients and subrecipients can own the units that are getting the rental assistance, and in leasing, you can't. In rental assistance, sponsor-based rental assistance, you must charge rent. In leasing, you can charge an occupancy charge, and how much it is different than could be different than what rent is. In sponsor-based rental assistance, you must have a lease, and you'll hear later in leasing there are some options. And because it's rental assistance, there is a match requirement in sponsor-based rental projects with sponsor-based rental assistance, and leasing there isn't. So again, if you are talking to an agency and they're describing their project to you, it may sound like it's sponsor-based rental assistance or leasing. And in fact, you'd probably have to ask them these 5 questions to find out if it was sponsor-based rental assistance or leasing. But they're very similar. So the word sponsor is defined as private nonprofit organizations or community mental health agencies established as a public nonprofit organization, which was the same definition used in Shelter Plus Care. It brings up some questions. And in fact, as we were putting this together, HUD and I went back and forth about, whether things were typos or not, because a definition of a subrecipient and a definition of the sponsor are actually not the same thing. So a subrecipient includes state, local government, or instrumentality of state or local government. But as you see here, sponsors don't include that. So I'm not sure what that means, because as defined currently, sponsors and subrecipients aren't the same thing. So I don't know of many rental assistance grants that currently use state or local governments or instrumentalities of local governments to be the intermediary, to be the sponsor or the in-between. But there may be some. But as of right now, the way it reads, it's not eligible. So is this something that gets fixed in the final rule? I don't know. We'll bring this to HUD's attention. The question is also that what is a sponsor then? Is a sponsor different than subrecipients? Can they be a rental assistance administrator? We'll get to that later. Do they have the same requirements for monitoring? Where does a sponsor fit in these roles and responsibilities? So I think that's something that HUD is going to be looking at, and it's a very small nuance that if you parse the rule, it becomes a bigger issue. Project-based rental assistance, you should be familiar with this. I think the subtle thing that came to my mind is that project-based rental assistance in the continuum of care program is clearly tied to the building. So if somebody gets assistance in the building, in a unit in the building, and then they want to move to a different unit in the building, they could continue to maintain that assistance. And I may be wrong, but I used to remember in Shelter Plus Care that it was more tied to the unit. But I think that may or may not have been true, or may have been unclear. But clearly now it is tied to the building. So you have if you have some project-based rental assistance Shelter Plus Care projects that are currently operating, they may have some more flexibility about where that people can move within the same building under the project-based rental assistance under the continuum of care program, under permanent supportive housing. Be clear when I'm saying SRO Shelter Plus Care, it is not the same thing as Section 8 Mod Rehab SRO. That's a whole separate program which we talked about last week, which isn't funded in the CoC program. So this was, the Shelter Plus Care had 4 components: tenant-based, sponsor-based, project-based, and SRO-based. The SRO-based will now, when it's renewed to the CoC program, will be a project-based rental assistance program. There are different lengths of rental assistance that can be provided, and I think we mentioned this on the last call, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And to use, as TA providers, we should consider short-term, we should use the vernacular up to 3 months, medium-term is 4 to 24, and long-term is more than 24. The reason the PH-PSH question mark is in there, and I think we touched on this last time, is that it actually doesn't say anywhere in the rule that permanent supportive housing projects must be offering long-term assistance. But it says it in questions in the virtual help desk. It says it in the startup training. And I'd like to say it's just an oversight that will be fixed when the rule is final, because the assumption is that the permanent supportive housing under the CoC program is long-term. So whereas rapid rehousing, you could have a short-term or medium-term program, rental assistance. Permanent supportive housing, you would just have long-term. So that's, again, a little nuance. If you have somebody who is very particular about the rule and says to you, I don't see anywhere in here it says that my permanent supportive housing has to have long-term assistance, I want to do it as short-term assistance, it's right. It's not in the rule. But we could find you virtual help desk questions and other things where it is. Okay, so I've zipped through that because you guys all know that stuff. And we're going to talk about leases. Leases is where it sometimes gets a little bit complicated. I like to talk about rental assistance because it's a little bit more straightforward. I gave the more complicated job to Liz to talk about leasing. But under rental assistance, tenant-based and project-based, first of all, under rental assistance, there must be a lease. So there's been some confusion, and we'll talk about it later. What's a lease? What's an occupancy agreement? When to use what? If a project has rental assistance, you must use a lease or a sublease. So that's the form of the written agreement. And in tenant-based and project-based leases, the lease is between the landowner or the property owner and the program participant. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts on that. Tenant-based and project-based, landowner and program participant. Recipient and there's also an agreement, however, between the recipient or subrecipient and the property owner, which spells out the amount of subsidy, spells out the landlord's requirements. Sometimes it's referred to as the housing assistance payment, which is a Section 8 housing choice voucher term. There's just sort of at least two written agreements. One that the lease between the owner and the participant, and one some sort of written agreement between the owner and the recipient or subrecipient who's paying the owner the subsidy on behalf of the program participant. Sponsor-based lease, sponsor-based rental assistance has another player in here, which is the sponsor who actually rents the unit from the owner and then subleases the unit to the program participant. So you can see there are 3 written agreements here. And I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about the format or length of the leases, because from last time, for example, transitional housing must be a term of at least a month for a maximum term of 24 months, permanent housing a year, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm assuming, again, that you guys know all that. So this is where the reg where it says rental assistance must use leases or subleases. In addition, any permanent housing project must use a lease or sublease. Any transitional housing project, if it has rental assistance funds in it, must use a lease or sublease because it falls under the clause above it. So it's really those transitional housing programs that don't have rental assistance funds that actually have an option. And I think this is very unclear to everybody because everybody keeps talking about occupancy agreements and when to use this and when to use that. And in fact, in the majority of cases, you should be using a lease or a sublease. So here we go. So if you have a permanent supportive housing, and that should say component should be in the other column. Sorry about that. If you have a permanent supportive housing component grant and it has rental assistance, because it has rental assistance, you must use a lease or sublease. You are not allowed to use an occupancy agreement. If you have leasing in that grant, you must also use a lease or sublease because it's a permanent housing grant. You can't use an occupancy agreement. And it's not on here, but it's come up. We're talking about leasing and rental assistance today. But let's just say you had only operating funds in there, not leasing or rental assistance. Because it's permanent housing, you would still have to have a lease or sublease. You would not use an occupancy agreement. For rapid rehousing, it can only be tenant-based rental assistance, so it must use a lease or sublease. For transitional housing, if you had rental assistance in that transitional housing, again, because it's rental assistance, you'd have to do lease or sublease. And transitional housing with leasing funds, that's where you can have an option of using a lease or sublease or an occupancy agreement. Along the same lines, if it had just operations funds in it, for example, you could use a lease or an occupancy agreement. So sometimes people seem to think that it's kind of there's not clarity in this area. Oh, should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? It's pretty clear that certain grants need to do certain things. So again, permanent housing must use lease sublease. Rental assistance must use lease sublease. So if the project has either of those characteristics, it must use a lease or sublease. Okay, so what is a lease? And this definition is from the AAQ. As you can see, it sort of says, you know, we expect that it is something that abides by tenant-landlord law in your area, and your lawyer or your, you know, general counsel says it's fine. HUD has published some sample leases, so, you know, if people are nervous, they can use those, including a 3-party lease. And, you know, they haven't specifically said it must be in writing, but since they say it must be signed, we're going to assume people need to have a written lease, which is an issue because in some places people have oral leases, or they had a written lease and it became an oral lease. You know, when it didn't get renewed, they said, oh, well, you can just stay here a little bit longer. But really, HUD, you know, I don't want to speak for them, but leases ensure sort of rights of tenancy, and they want to make sure things are in place. So tenants at will, which are very common, may or may not work. Tenants at will often do not have a lease, a written lease. In this case, they would need to have a written lease. People kind of use the term lease and occupancy agreement interchangeably, and you know, it's the only time you would have an occupancy agreement that HUD requires, again, is projects that just have leasing or operating funds and they are not permanent housing. So, you know, I think there's some still defining, and I think HUD has said, you know, what works for you and your community, every community is different, is fine as a lease, and as long as, you know, it doesn't have any special provisions in it or something, because this is a HUD-funded program. So, for example, you can't say, oh, this is a rental assistance program for people with mental illness. Well, we do have a public laundry room, but because you're in this program, you can only use it during the hours of, you know, 10 p.m. to midnight. So things like that, obviously, are not going to fly. HUD also indicates, as I mentioned before, that there should be some written contract between the property owner and either the recipient or subrecipient that basically says, I am going to pay you a subsidy, which in this case would be equal to the contract rent minus the tenant portion of the rent, and we'll get into that when we do some rent calculations later. And it should say, you know, the owner is responsible for keeping the unit habitable, you know, meeting HQS, reporting if they have to report on things. There is, I think, a sample HAP on the HUD website near the leases. And if not, you could take a look at the Section 8 one. I don't think there's a specific required form for this. One thing to be aware, when I said lease provisions, there is an allowance within the continuum care program rule that if you are running, if your project is designed to provide sober housing, then you can use a lease that prohibits people from possessing, using, or being under the influence of illegal substances and or alcohol on the premises. So, I think the question is, for the agency to really say this is completely sober housing. This is the only allowed lease addendum. Everything else must be in accordance with tenant and landlord law. Okay. I just want to make sure I haven't missed questions yet, right? Nope. Okay, I'm going to keep going then.
Oh, actually,
maybe we should stop for questions.
Yeah,
because I've said a lot. I mean, I can keep going, but I think I've said a lot. Maybe we can ask for questions.
Okay.
Emily, there's Brooke mentioned that you might want to clarify on slide 32.
Yeah. So when I say where these leasing requirements come from, when you use a lease or a sublease, whereas 578.51 says if you're using rental assistance, you must use a lease. It's in the definition of permanent housing in the definition section of the rule where it says it must use a lease or sublease. So it's in there, it's just in a different place. And actually, it's in the definitions of permanent housing and transitional housing where it also says, how long the lease should be, how you can terminate it. So don't skip over the definition section. It's just as important as the rest of it. So if people want to ask questions, do they unmute themselves?
No, folks could just raise their hand.
Raise your hand if you have a question.
And I don't see anyone with that right now. So,
because I'm crystal clear, or they're all asleep. Okay. All right, then I'll just keep on going. I feel like I threw down my own gauntlet, which was last time I was completely on time. So, I now have to do that again. And it was a fluke last time. So, okay, we're going to talk about use of funds of rental assistance, and we talked about most of this during the last session, but so you should know that it can be used for first and last month's rent up to 1 month, security deposits up to 2 months. That's different than last time. It was 1 month last time. Property damages up to 1 month, vacancy payments up to 1 month, and the cost of administering the rental assistance. And you guys should be aware of this. People always ask, could an owner wind up, we gave them a security deposit when they moved in. When the person moved out, there was property damage beyond the security deposit, so they kept the security deposit, and then there was more damage, and so we paid them a property damage based on the damage. And then we wanted to keep the unit, so we gave them a vacancy payment. Yeah, I mean, you could do that. I think the issue is, again, with all of these, is that these are grant savings activities, so you just need to make sure you have enough money to meet your grant obligations, which is serving the same number of people for the length of time left in the grant. So some key differences. Security deposits was previously 1 month. There's some questions about who gets the security deposit when it's returned. That's on the thorny issues document that was part of the required reading, or the nuanced issues, excuse me. And there's some questions about paying a security deposit in sponsor-based rental assistance, because are you paying it to the property owner, or are you paying it to the sponsor? And if you're, there's some questions when we get to program fees, the way program fees have been designed and defined, or the way that HUD is the HUD stance currently says that you can charge people rent or an occupancy charge and nothing else. So does that sort of rule out a participant having to pay a security deposit? Now, many programs say, I'm serving chronically homeless people, they have no income, I'm not going to charge them a security deposit, we're going to negotiate, or I'll cover that with the grant, they shouldn't pay out of pocket. But there are some programs, especially I find programs that serve people with substance abuse that view it really as a program, and they want people to have some ownership of the property, or part of their responsibility and their service plan is to save enough for security deposits so they can, so it's more of a structured philosophy. Sometimes ask people to submit, to provide some part of the security deposit. So that may or may not still be allowed, and I don't think we have clarity on that. First and last month's rent is allowed, and the rule clarifies it can be advance payment. Property damages, again, what's different here is it clarifies that it's a one-time cost per program participant. So, the question that I think is still out there is does that mean program participant for their length of time in the program, or does that mean every program participant in that housing unit? So, did you get one when you left Unit A and you got one when you left Unit B, or is it you only get one in Unit A and then you never get one again? So that's a question, and I don't think we have an answer to that. And in this, it says it's incurred at the time a participant exits the housing unit. Sponsor-based rental assistance has a sponsor in the middle who hasn't, they're responsible for dealing with some of the damages, and some things happen as the person is in the unit. So do you have to wait? Let's say the do something and the stove breaks and they have to repair the stove. There's questions of whether the sponsor can use the shelter plus. Excuse me, that's my old school. They can use the rental assistance funds for property damage, even though the participant is still living there. So these are, again, nuanced questions we do not have the answer to. Rental assistance administration costs. This is something we're going to spend a fair amount of time on in a few minutes, but just to know that previously these costs were administrative costs under Shelter Plus Care, and it's a shift, so we'll talk about that. Just keep in mind it's one pot of money. So again, it's a formula grant. Based on a formula. So you might have grant savings because you serve fewer people, or because the rents are lower, or because there are vacancies, whatever the reason is. But you still have to make sure you have enough moving forward to ensure that you're meeting your grant obligations, serving the correct number of people for the remainder of the grant. And in fact, Shelter Plus Care has typically had problems with both overspending and underspending. These problems, you would imagine, would persist in rental assistance projects because they have the same model unless folks are able to figure out how to get around that. Any questions? I'm not going to wait too long because you guys had the opportunity. I don't see anybody raising their hand, I think. Okay, let's talk about rent. All units assisted with pretty much any federal funds must meet rent reasonableness standards, and that's because HUD doesn't want to pay any more than the average person would pay in the community. So you have to make sure, and they don't want to inflate the rents in the community either. So you have to make sure that the rent is reasonable when it's compared to other units in the area, in the similar place, that are of the similar size and offer similar amenities. Keep in mind, if it's a permanent supportive housing project, it must be for people with disabilities. And when we talk about similar amenities, we're talking about comparing apples to apples. So if you have a handicapped accessible unit with certain modifications in it, then you have to compare it to something similar. Maybe it's even based on location. So if you have a unit that's located near a traffic light that makes noise for people who are visually impaired, then you have to keep in mind units in that same location. Or if a person has to live near their support system because they need to be able to walk to their mental health provider, then that's something, again, those are considered, should be considered amenities when you're talking about rent reasonableness. And we're looking at the contract rent for the unit. So not the rent plus utilities, not the gross rent, but the contract rent when you're doing rent comps. Every project should have a policy in place, but again, this is where I suggest that you review the rent reasonableness and fair market rent under the CoC program guidance, because it really nicely spells it out, because the ESG folks did such a great job. What's not clear is how often you need to do those rent reasonableness reviews. In general, you know, you would need to do it when somebody first moves into a unit, because you can't pay rent on a unit unless it meets the rent reasonableness determination. But then once they're in there, do you need to keep ensuring it meets the rent reasonableness requirement? Well, the Shelter Plus Care Resource Manual said do it annually, and they also said you don't have to do it on a unit-by-unit basis. You could do it in a certain geographic area. And the Housing Choice Voucher Program says you have to do it initially with rent increases, with a decrease in FMR, or if told by HUD. The CoC program interim rule does not say anything, so except that you need to meet rent reasonableness. So the question is, you know, what standard will be okay? And I think that's something that HUD is going to have to clarify. But again, you might get this question in the field, and you get to say there's not guidance on it yet. But you know, I think you could assume that it's probably good practice to do it annually, and it's good practice to do it when an owner requests a rent increase. And to do it initially. You know, I think they can't go wrong by doing that. But just to be clear, you know, there specifically isn't guidance. You guys probably are all familiar with the fair market rent, or FMR. The one thing that always, two things that always mess me up, that the FMRs are published in October, but the FY 2014 FMRs were published in October 1st of 2013. And that always messed me up, or October 5th, or somewhere around there. So when you're talking about which FMRs you should use, right now we're using the FY 14 FMRs, even though we're in calendar year 13. So just a nuance to be clear of which when you're looking at fair market rents, and that FMRs assume the cost of utilities included, and Liz will talk about utilities in a little bit. So rental assistance, you get funded on that formula based on the fair market rent. You apply based on what the fair market rent is when you're currently. So if you applied today, you would use the FY 14 fair market rent. However, when you're funded, you get funded at the fair market rent that's in place when you get at the time of the award. So that may be different. So let's say the application was due to HUD September 1st. You would be using 1 year's FMRs, and then new FMRs came out October 1st. The awards were made December 1st. They would have a different FMR. And the amount of the budget would be different because of that. Also, you're given a budget for a certain amount of time. Let's say you applied for a 3-year project. The fair market rent may go up or down during that time. And the only in rental assistance projects, you don't have to stick to the FMR. You have to make sure it's rent reasonable. But if the rent reasonableness standard is above or below the FMR, then you can actually rent it at over the FMR, for example, or under the FMR. Again, if you rent over the FMR, the issue is that you have one pot of money and you could run out if it's a 3-year grant. I worked with a housing authority, a 5-year grant. They ran out at 3 years because they just kept giving people units at the FMR that kept going up 10% each year. So it's just like this is nothing new to these providers who had Shelter Plus Care. It's the same exact thing. So just to clarify again, unit rents who get rental assistance funds can exceed the fair market rent but must meet rent reasonableness. So if the reasonable rent in a 1-bedroom unit is $600 and the fair market rent is $575, then you could pay $600, assuming that's what you determined was reasonable, and you had the funds available. If you don't have the funds available, then it's, even though the reasonable rent is $600, you pay $575. Again, you know, some of this is a calculation because the tenant may pay part of the rent, so you may not, the subsidy you're paying may not be the full $575. So it's sort of a grants management, financial management issue. This isn't new. Again, this is present in Shelter Plus Care, but it's a key thing that in rental assistance you can pay above or below the FMR if funds are available and the unit meets rent reasonableness. Okay, and there are, when talking about rent reasonableness and how you meet, you know, what sources you can use, that comes up a lot. And actually, the ESG document had a lot of information, and that's now in your rent reasonableness and fair market rent under the CoC program. That's sources, some websites, newspaper listings, things like that. There's often a question of, can I use Craigslist listings for rent reasonableness? And right now that's a major form of advertising, and so at least the other document that was published by HUD sort of allows for newspaper listings, and that would include electronic ones. All right, so I've talked a lot about people paying rent. Let's figure out, I think we mentioned this in the last session, rent must be charged if the project has rental assistance funds. Excuse me, it must be equal to the highest of 3 calculations. 30% of the families, and when we say family here, it's the household's monthly adjusted income. It's adjusted for certain allowances and deductions. We are not going to get into that today just because of amount of time, but there's a whole rent calculation standard and what those allowances are and deductions are. 10% of the household's monthly gross income, or the portion of the family's welfare assistance if that's designated for payment of rent. And that is different in each state. So that's something that a person needs to research. It's not different usually by locality, but it's different by each state. And so I would encourage, if you're working with somebody who doesn't know, I would encourage them to talk to the HUD field office, because it's something that or talk to local housing authority, because they would know. Please, please, please remember that this does not apply to rapid rehousing projects. So even though there's tenant-based rental assistance in rapid rehousing projects, if we recall from last time, the rapid rehousing projects are actually able to have some flexibility about if they charge people rent and how much and how that's calculated. So again, it would apply to PSH projects and transitional housing projects. Some nuanced issues. So people, when they got the rule and they read every word of it, said, it doesn't say anywhere that I have to charge people rent, or it doesn't say anywhere how I charge people rent. It says very clearly about the occupancy charge, and the occupancy charge, as you'll hear later, is different. It says you can't charge them more than these highest of the 3 calculations. Where does it say I must charge them rent and it must be the highest of these 3 calculations? Well, the rule in 578.77C1 says, you must charge them rent, and it has to be calculated in accordance with 42 U.S.C. blah, blah, blah. If you go to 42 U.S.C. blah, 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 that's where it says those 3 calculations, and you have to choose the highest of. So not everything is always in the rule. And so people often were looking for this and couldn't find it, and you have to sort of take it to the next step or do your little Sherlock Holmes and dig down to see what every reference is. There was a slide in the startup trainings about this, and it was a little bit confusing, so I just want to make sure that if you did any startup trainings, you realized that if you read something, it was a little off. So rental assistance must be the highest of these 3 figures. You know what? I'd like to stop for questions for a sec. Just see if anybody has any questions. Okay. I feel like I'm talking a lot. I can't believe I've been so clear that nobody has any questions. No, you know what I can believe is that you guys already know this stuff. So. Okay.
Well,
I'm going to move
on.
A little
check-in with people? I'm just wondering whether we should do a little check-in with people. Are you? It is a lot of information. Are you feeling anything you want to share besides the question, or? We're not getting anything. Okay.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to finish up rental assistance.
Hey, guys. Sorry.
Yeah?
Sorry, stop. Okay. One quick second. Sharon Price, I'm going to try to unmute you, Sharon. It looks like you're connected to your computer, but I'm going to hit unmute and hopefully can
Yep, that worked. Hey, Emily. Quick question about just rent calculations, and if you go to the onecpd.info and there's the rent calculation calculator.
Yeah.
And it specifically does not mention ESG or CoC. And I was just wondering if there was a reason for that, or if there is any difference that we should be aware of that, you know, why they didn't put it on there, and if there's any difference?
So I'm going to punt that question. Maybe Sharon London is on the phone, can unmute, because I think ICF developed that, and when it came out and we said, oh, it doesn't look like you can use, it's not for CoC or ESG, there was some conversation about they were going to do one or something. So,
so Sharon, you're unmuted now too, if you want to weigh in.
Sharon London, do you want to answer for, if you know?
Can you hear me? Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay,
Great.
So we had started to develop them actually for the programs, but it was part of the CoC program in a rule being released, and so we stopped. There was no point in putting an effort into developing something that wasn't really going to be useful in the long term. And so we haven't, we just haven't been asked by HUD to proceed. So Susanna would probably know if it's something that's in the plans at this point.
So I guess, is there any difference in the sort of standard Section 8, that everybody else uses, that the CoC is there any difference?
There's no difference in coming up with the 3 calculations. So you come up with the 3 calculations the same. We will talk about the earned income disregard, which plays a role, but you come up with the 3 calculations the same, but what you do at the end is what's different. So a lot of housing authorities have actually used their Section 8 programs and been overcharging people rent. And then when HUD comes out and monitors, they're like, no, you charge them 40% of their income, which is allowed under Section 8. And it's not allowed under either shelter plus care or rental assistance. So I think the calculation for Section 8 is the same, and then what you do with the information is different for grants for Section 8, for rental assistance, and for leasing.
Right. Okay, thank you.
So if you can stop people before they make the judgment, then you'll be okay.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. So the rental assistance administrator is a large issue that you may have heard about. Or if you haven't, you're very lucky. HUD is currently working on it. It's in the nuanced issues. First, let's just talk about what are considered to be rental administration costs, rental assistance administration costs. And this was not in the rule itself. And this is HUD guidance since then has put out that there are 5 things that are considered rental assistance administration costs, which is processing rental payments, examining participant income, providing housing information, HQS and inspections, and receiving new participants in the program. Let me stop there for 1 second, which is I know the folks on the AAQ are saying, wait, there was a different definition of rental assistance before, which was contracting for and making rental assistance payments to the landlord and conducting HQS inspections. So when the rule first came out, there was a lot of conversation about what is rental assistance administration, because there are limits on who can do that. I think there was, it was an evolving concept. Right now, where we are is that these 5 things are administrative costs for rental assistance, and that these are listed also in the operating instructions that went out to field offices when they were developing, when they were signing FY12 renewal grants, so that people could, these are what's being used as the grants are becoming effective. Will it change in the future? Possibly. But right now, I mean, it already has changed. It went from 2 to 5. So people may be still confused about it. How you pay for these costs is either you have to do it through your matching funds or you do it through your grant. And again, you've got that one pot of money. So if you've paid for your subsidies and you've paid for you want to do security deposits and vacancy payments and property damages and all those things, you may not have money left over to pay for administration costs. But it is an eligible cost. But it's again, it's sort of a pay yourself last in that you have to, again, make sure you're paying the rent for people and can meet your obligations under the grant before you would take any administration costs. What's interesting in the way it's playing out is that these 5, for folks who are familiar with Shelter Plus Care, these 5 costs were project admin costs before and not Shelter Plus Care subsidy costs. And now they are not administrative costs, they are rental assistance costs. So it's if you do a training with people and you talk to them, you see the lights start going on in some folks' eyes because they start saying, hey, we've been doing those things, but because it was, we weren't getting any admin money before, but now we can get rental assistance money to do some of these things. And we're going to go, and not only that, there are admin costs that we weren't getting paid for before, that nobody was getting paid for before because it's a new sort of cost for Shelter Plus Care grants, and there's a requirement that 50% of the funds must go to us. So it starts everybody rethinking their relationships between recipients and subrecipients, and thinking, okay, well, there are things I was doing, and now the rule says I can get paid for them, and there are things the recipient wasn't doing, and they were getting paid for. So again, it's the same pot of money. So once you remind them of that, sometimes the light goes out, and they say, oh, there's no extra money there. But it is a change in the relationship between of who may create a change in the relationship of who's doing what. Okay, so who can administer the rental assistance? Well, according to this little line in the CoC program interim rule, which has caused a lot of conversation, it must be administered by a state, unit, local government, or public housing agency. And I think when the interim rule was written, and actually this is in statute, everybody assumed that all the Shelter Plus Care projects out there, which is basically what these projects are turning into, were being administered by states, units of local governments, and public housing agencies, because those were the eligible grantees under Shelter Plus Care. And what turns out that, no, that's actually not the case. Many of those eligible grantees contracted out a lot of the work to nonprofits. So the state of Maine, it's all a nonprofit organization. State of New Hampshire, it's all a nonprofit. State of Massachusetts, same thing. So this has become an issue. So one way that I dealt with it is they made an exception, and this is sort of in that renewal language that's in the interim rule that allows them to make exceptions for projects that don't quite meet all the criteria of the interim rule, but are I'm not supposed to say the word grandfather. They're going to be allowed to continue doing what they're doing under the new program as long as they don't make any changes. So the same thing they said, if under the rental, if your project was currently using a nonprofit to administer the rental assistance under Shelter Plus Care project, you can keep doing that for a renewal grant. But for a new grant, you can't. So you may have folks who applied for new funding who actually had to come up with a different agency to administer the rental assistance. HUD is working on this and is trying to fix it in some way. But this gets to why defining what the rental assistance administration activities are so important. And this also harkens back to the sponsor-based rental assistance. You have an agency, which is a nonprofit, who is paying rent in that situation, and they are not technically a rental assistance administrator. So there are some things that need to be worked out. Does this include rapid rehousing? That is the question of the day. The statute requires that all rental assistance be subject to this, but the program interim rule does not. Currently the guidance that's coming out through the Ask a Question desk and the virtual help desk is that yes, that rapid rehousing projects would need to abide by the rental assistance administration in the requirement in the interim rule. But it is not, if people go looking for it, it's not there. There aren't that many, so there aren't a ton of projects this affects, except for some renewal projects, because the new rapid rehousing projects under the continuum of care are just starting this year, and would have hopefully their structure includes an eligible rental assistance administrator. But those are big assumptions on my part, so I'm sure it affects more people. There also, when all of this conversation started happening, HUD was asked to define what a public housing agency is. and it's public housing agencies that meet a certain definition who are eligible to apply for administer rental assistance. When I talk to many agencies, they say, I'm a public housing authority because I, for example, administer Section 8 vouchers. Well, there are about 20 nonprofit agencies that administer Section 8 vouchers, or maybe even more, that are public housing agencies, but they may not be because they have a contract for Section 8, but they may not be public housing authorities because that's something defined by state and local law as well as federal law. So this has been a tricky issue as well. If you go back to this regulation, 24 CFR 5.1, it actually then refers you back to another, to the Housing Act, which then gives a requirements about the board, membership of the board of directors in order to meet the standards of what a housing authority is. There have been some questions answered by HUD. Can a nonprofit recipient procure another nonprofit to administer rental assistance? Nope. Can a nonprofit recipient subgrant to an eligible rental assistance administrator that then subgrants to a nonprofit to administer rental assistance? No. And then the question of, can sponsors and projects with sponsor-based rental assistance administer rental assistance, and we don't know. Lastly, there's been some conversation about the difference between a subrecipient and a contractor. So there's a question that can an eligible rental assistance administrator procure a nonprofit contractor to carry out some of the rental assistance administration activities? And HUD has put out some language about what makes a contractor who is hired who is procured to do certain specific goods or for certain goods or services, and is not involved in policy or programmatic decisions, is a contractor versus a subrecipient. It's a very subtle difference, and I would suggest that you print out this slide 58, because in the notes it actually references proposed OMB uniform guidance where it defines what a subrecipient is and what a contractor is. I have to say I'm still a little hazy on when something's a subrecipient and when something's a contractor, and I just keep crossing my fingers and saying, well, hopefully the HUD will work with Congress to fix the rental assistance administration language, and this will be kind of a moot issue. That's just my hope. Special note on rapid rehousing and rental assistance. Again, I think you know this must be tenant-based because it's permanent housing, must have a lease. The rental assistance must be short-term or medium-term. It can be used for security deposits and first and last month's rent, and you must follow the written policies and procedures established by the CoC for determining and prioritizing which families will receive assistance and standards for determining the amount or percentage of rent that every person must pay. I'm pretty sure we've touched on all of these. The one thing, talked a little bit about written standards, and we're going to talk about this in the establishing and operating a CoC, but there's been a lot of questions about the written standards, and there are different requirements. So recipients must adhere to standards established, this is rapid rehousing recipients, to standards established by the CoC for the amount or percentage of rent that everybody must pay. So for example, the CoC establishes a standard that says all rapid rehousing projects within our CoC must require participants to pay no more than 50% of their income for rent. Okay, so that's a standard that goes across all rapid rehousing projects. But then the recipient itself can include a policy that includes a maximum amount or maximum number of rents, of months of rental assistance, or a number of times that somebody can receive assistance. So within the CoC standards, a specific recipient of rapid rehousing funds could say, I'm going to have a policy that requires participants to pay 30% of their income for rent, because that fits within the standard for the continuum of care for all rapid rehousing projects. So people get confused as to, well, wait, it says I need to follow their standards, but it says I must have policies. So this is just an example of how you could do both. Lastly, in the rule, it does it says that it does not list property damages as an eligible use of rental assistance funds under rapid rehousing. So, folks can use funds for security deposits, and those could be used by the owner to pay for any property damages. But property damages are not an eligible use of funds under permanent housing, rapid rehousing projects. Okay, that's it for rental assistance.
Okay.
Any questions about rental assistance?
So Emily, we did have a couple questions come in. Colleen, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line now. So give me one quick second. You should be able to talk. Okay, Colleen, I think you should be all set now.
You can hear me?
Yep.
I can, yeah.
Okay. So two things, but the one thing we can't really answer is that whole 50% administration with the rental assistance, because especially with sponsored base, there's a lot of pieces that each entity might do. So I guess that's kind of a relationship thing, and I don't think there's going to be any kind of clear guidance around how do you really split that 50% off if, you know,
and I think
are you actually doing 80% of that administration,
right.
and maybe the sponsors doing 20%.
I think the AAQ has a bunch of questions they're working on as to how do you split. If you're telling us to split the 50-50, but what's the division of work is different, or there's multiple agencies doing the work. So I think that's something they're still working on. But I think that we're covering admin in a different session. But yes.
Yeah. And my other question was that you answered the questions about not being able to procure somebody, but I thought in one of the nuance issue documents prior to the start of trainings it said with those renewals, where the Shelter Plus Care renewals, the nonprofit can still administer, but I thought that they had to go through a procurement process to be able to do that. Not to talk about the grandfathering, but those that are renewing from Shelter Plus Care and they have the nonprofit, and HUD said, well, we're going to allow the nonprofits to still administer. I thought in that document it said they can, but they have to go through a procurement process for that to happen. But that might not be.
I don't know that, but maybe, you know, I don't have always the most current information. So maybe does anybody else want to chime in? And I can look at the nuanced issues thing too.
This is Liz.
I remember reading that in one of the nuanced issues, you know, prior to when we did the startup training about that. But yeah, so that's just a question.
Liz, did you have an answer?
Oh, I don't think that my understanding has been that they can just continue to do so, and that there wasn't necessarily had to be any kind of procurement process.
Okay, great. Thanks.
No problem. I'll look up in the nuanced issues too.
The nuanced issues, as far as I understand them, is that somebody that's eligible to do the administration can procure a nonprofit to do it, as long as the eligible entity is making the policies and making the decisions. But a nonprofit cannot procure for another nonprofit to do their administration.
But any new project. And if you make a change to the project that exists, or you want to do a new project, then you lose this special exception.
Right. Okay.
Other questions? Okay, I'm going to – oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say it looks like that was it. So, sorry.
Okay, I'm going to give my hand it over to Liz here.
Okay.
Liz, do you got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so if hands start shooting up when I'm going through this, I'm going to assume that's because this is very complicated and not because I'm not as crystal clear as Emily. But just to get started, I'm going to be going through all the leasing standards, some of the key requirements, nuanced issues that exist, and we'll continue to highlight those distinctions between leasing and rental assistance. So under leasing, you can use leasing funds in permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, where you're providing your leasing housing for participants. You can also use leasing funds in an SSO where you're leasing a property to provide services. And one key point here on this slide that you should point out to recipients is that leasing office space for HMIS activities is an eligible cost, but it's an eligible HMIS cost. It is not an eligible leasing activity. So one of the key restrictions in leasing that is different from rental assistance is that leasing funds cannot be used to lease units that are owned by the recipient, a subrecipient, or any kind of parent or affiliated organization. However, HUD does have the authority to grant an exception to this, but there is a burden on the recipient to show that there's a good reason for this, that it's in the best interest of the program. They need to show that whatever leasing charges that are going to be paid with the grant funds, that it's reasonable for the market. And they also have to have a written policy for resolving disputes, because there is sort of going to be a conflict of interest there where the landlord is also the recipient. So they have to make sure they have a policy for that. So those exception requests have to be submitted to HUD at the time of the project's technical submission. So what can you do with leasing funds? The primary use of leasing funds is going to be to rent a structure or an individual unit. If you are renting a structure, you can actually use up to, you can use leasing funds for up to 100% of those costs, as long as the rent is reasonable, which is different than if you are renting individual units. If you are doing that, then you have to make sure that the leasing funds used to pay that rent cannot exceed FMR, and rent reasonable supplies there as well, but the leasing funds cannot exceed FMR. And we're going to go into FMR a little bit later. In addition to rent, you can use leasing funds for security deposits up to 2 months rent. You can use it for first and last for up to 1 month each. You can provide rent on vacant units, but it's not considered a vacancy payment, essentially because, as Emily already went over earlier, or I don't know, I forget if she did, but under leasing, and we'll get into leasing arrangements in a bit, the lease is going to be between the recipient and the property owner directly. So because they have that obligation in the lease to pay the rent, they can use leasing funds to pay that rent regardless of whether there's someone in the unit or not. Property damages are not an eligible use of leasing funds. However, leasing recipients can have an operating budget line item, so if they have that, repairs could be made using that, or security deposit that they use on the unit could be used to cover the damages as well. Okay, so for SSO projects, they can use leasing funds as well. It's going to be the same allowable cost that we just went over. Just to highlight there is that they're doing it to provide services. So if they are leasing a building and they owe a security deposit, you know, they can use the leasing funds to pay for that. Okay, so now we're going to get into the types of agreements that have to be in place with leasing funds. As I just stated, under leasing, the recipient or the subrecipient have to have a lease with the property owner, and the rule actually outlines that it has to be a lease, so not an occupancy agreement. But there really isn't any other guidance as to what that format needs to look like or how long it could be. It's basically going to be up to the recipient how they want to manage that lease agreement with the property owner. However, for program participants, the leasing arrangement is that the recipient has a lease with the property owner, and then they have to have either a sublease or an occupancy agreement with the program participant, and that's going to depend what they have on whether or not they're doing permanent housing or transitional housing. So as Emily had stated earlier, in the definitions of the interim rule, permanent housing, you have to have a lease. So if you're doing permanent supported housing with leasing funds, you need to have a sublease with that program participant. If you're doing transitional housing, you can choose whether it's going to be a sublease or an occupancy agreement with that program participant. So again, this is pretty much the only time where you're going to see recipients having the option of doing a sublease or an occupancy agreement. It's in transitional housing with leasing dollars or potentially with operating dollars. And that same stipulation applies for those recipients that are operating sober housing. They can include prohibitions in the lease agreements or occupancy agreements that participants cannot possess or use illegal substances or alcohol. So this slide just sort of shows what the arrangement is for transitional housing and permanent sort of housing. Again, the recipient is going to have a lease directly with the owner. They're then going to have a sublease or an occupancy agreement depending on whether it's transitional housing or permanent supportive housing. If it is transitional housing, the lease has to be for a term of at least a month, and it needs to be automatically renewable. It can be for no longer than 24 months, since that's for as long as transitional housing can last for. And under permanent supportive housing, it has to be for at least a year, automatically renewable, and only terminable for cause. This just shows the SSO arrangement. Again, they just have to make sure they have a lease with the owner, but there's no other additional guidance around that. So some of the nuanced issues around the agreements are the length. Again, you got to make sure that you follow that recipients are following the terms of 1 month for transitional housing or a year for permanent housing, but there's not necessarily any kind of required length for the lease with the recipient and the property owner. And some SHP programs have actually not been using leases or subleases, so they are going to have to start doing that. Based on HUD's interpretation, really they've been operating out of compliance by not holding a lease with the property owner directly. So they have to make sure that they're coming into compliance, as well as for these new projects or the renewals. But one thing to mention, that in that thorny issues document, it does outline, HUD understands it's going to take time to come into compliance, and that can be done through attrition. But if there is a reason why recipients may need a longer time, that thorny issues document actually outlines some reasons where HUD may make an exception to allow a longer period of time to come into compliance. And this last bullet just is noting that, leasing funds operate a lot like sponsor-based rental assistance. So some of the nuanced issues around the leasing agreements are really what defines a lease or a sublease or an occupancy agreement. What is the distinctions between those? Does it need to be in writing? Again, as with rental assistance that Emily stated, basically recipients need to consult with an attorney, make sure that they're following their own state or local laws to make sure that they're in compliance with that, and that they're using the terms that are required under the CoC program interim rule. There are examples of leases and occupancy agreements online that HUD's published, one of which is a 3-party agreement. And this might be used helpful for recipients in those situations where, especially for SHP, former SHP, if they were operating out of compliance and they had leases, the clients held the leases directly with the property owners, this may be a way to sort of negotiate as a transition, or if they are having problems with getting the property owners to hold the leases directly with them. They can have this 3-party lease. And it's also helpful for other funding programs. For example, in the low-income housing tax credit program, a 3-party lease might be the way to go if that is going to make it easier to be in compliance with that program. Okay, so what are the rent limits for leasing? So FMR does apply in leasing. However, it's not how the leasing budget line item amount is calculated. As Emily stated earlier, that's the leasing budget is sort of, they come up with that, the recipients come up with that based on the average monthly rent they pay per unit, per bedroom size. However, the amount of leasing funds that they can actually pay towards rent does need to be within the FMR. And the FMR assumes that utilities are part of that calculation. So if utilities are not included, recipients will need to look at the rent plus utilities and make sure that the amount that they are paying towards rent does not exceed the FMR. However, they do have the option of using non-CoC program funds to cover the difference if there is any. And one thing to note here too is that when we're talking about compliance with FMR, we're talking about individual units. For structures, FMR doesn't apply. It's only rent reasonableness applies when you're talking about leasing structures. So similar to rental assistance, all units have to have rents that are reasonable. The total contract rent for the unit must be reasonable. And again, if it is over the FMR and you're leasing individual units, you have to make sure that you're using the non-CoC program funds, but the unit rent still needs to be reasonable regardless. And so rent reasonableness, you just want to make sure recipients are taking into account location, amenities, unit size, all of those different things, those examples that Emily gave earlier. So here's an example of how the leasing rent limits would work. You just want to keep in mind that both rent reasonableness and the fair market rent apply when we're talking about leasing individual structures, and it's going to be the lower of the two is what you need to go with. So in that first example, the reasonable rent is $600, the fair market rent is $575. Well, because the fair market rent is lower, you need to go with the $575, and you cannot pay, use leasing, CoC leasing dollars can pay no more than the $575. In the second example, the reasonable rent is lower, but the FMR is higher. In that situation, you still have to follow the lower of the two, so that is the $1050. And the third example, they're even, so you know, you can pay the $1450. However, if it is above the FMR, you could use non-CoC program funds to cover the difference. So some of the nuanced issues around that are what kind of funds can you use to cover the difference? Could you use occupancy charges to cover the difference? Could other program income be used? With the FMR, this question comes up a lot. What is the FMR that you're supposed to be using to determine, you know, is it the FMR in place at the time of application that you need to use to make sure it doesn't go over that, or is it the FMR that you're using at lease-up? How does that work? So those are some nuanced issues that HUD is still developing guidance for. So again, the rent limits do not apply for structures that you're leasing, but rent reasonableness does. Okay, so occupancy charges under leasing are different than under rental assistance. For rental assistance, you are required to impose a specific rent charge. With leasing, recipients actually have the option of whether they're going to charge an occupancy charge. But if they do, they have to make sure that they charge no more than the highest of those three calculations, so 30%, the 10%, or the welfare rent. And in addition to this, if they are charging an occupancy charge, if they're choosing to do that, they need to make sure that they are treating all the participants the same, that they're not charging the brown-eyed people 30% and then charging the blue-eyed people 0. They have to make sure that they have a process in place for how they're going to determine the amount of the charge, and it has to be clearly outlined, and they do have to make sure that they do this specific calculation to ensure that no participant is being charged more than the highest of those three calculations. And you just want to keep in mind that participant contributions towards for an occupancy charge are considered program income. Okay, special considerations for both rental assistance and leasing. We're going to move out of the leasing now just to talk about both. Staff and overhead costs that are directly related to carrying out either a leasing activity or a rental assistance activity are considered eligible under that budget line item. So if they are doing HQS inspections, if they're calculating rent, paying the landlords, all of those different activities can be charged that to either leasing, if they're a leasing recipient, or rental assistance as part of that rental assistance budget line item. However, there's not any additional money that they're getting provided to do these things. It's all going to be part of that predetermined budget amount that they already have. So people just need to make sure they understand that, and that these sort of activities are different than project administration. That's completely separate. And just a note here that this language, the staff and overhead costs, it actually comes out of the section in the interim rule on project administration, just saying that, you know, direct service-related costs, you know, are actually eligible activities under that line item. So this applies to any kind of activity. If we're talking about operating, the staff time to do different operating activities is an eligible operating cost. And this is a big difference now for recipients that were, they were budgeting these kind of activities differently beforehand. So another key difference now under the program for rental assistance and leasing is that you cannot charge program fees. You could do this under SHP, so it is a big difference for some people. But it's no longer an allowable saying you can't do program fees. You can. Some people have been operating where they've been calling what is really essentially an occupancy charge. They've been calling it a program fee. So they would just have to make sure that going forward that they make it clear in all of their documentation and whatever their subleases or occupancy agreements that they're choosing to charge an occupancy charge and it's not a program fee. And essentially, if you look at that thorny document issue, a program fee is pretty much defined as anything other than an occupancy charge or rent. And so some nuanced issues around that are, would a portion of security deposit of the participant, would that be considered a program fee? Would food stamps that are given to the recipient to buy food for the program, would that be considered a program fee? So there are a lot of implications here for recipients that have been charging program fees, and they're going to have to find ways to cover those costs now because they are not allowed to continue to charge program fees. Okay, another key distinction is program income. Program income under the CoC program is essentially any kind of income that's directly generated from the grant. This includes tenant rent payments and occupancy charges. Those are considered program income. This is not, when we say tenant rent payments, we're not talking about rent payments that are provided to private property owners like in tenant-based rental assistance. That would not be considered program income. It's only income that the recipient is actually receiving. So whether it's sponsor-based rental assistance or if it's leasing and the recipient is getting a direct occupancy charge, that is program income. And under the new program, program income is not an eligible source of match. And again, the thorny issue document actually outlines sort of the basis for why that is, if you want to take a look at that. So some special questions for projects with operating funds. The rule is actually silent on a couple of different areas that it's very specific with leasing and rental assistance. So one of these areas is with projects with operating funds, whether or not they can charge an occupancy charge. It's silent in the rule. So HUD is still determining whether or not they can charge an occupancy charge, and if they can, what that amount would have to be. So those are still being worked out. All right, does anyone have any questions?
Okay, Liz, we did have a couple that came in around utilities and talking a bit about that. So hang tight one quick second. And Colleen, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you since you had a couple questions. So you should be all set in just a second. Okay, should be good.
Okay, so my first question is, and that this came up at one of our startups, which is with leasing funds, can you pay for rent and utilities if utilities are not included if it does not exceed the FMR?
You know what? We're going to talk about utilities in more depth in like the next section.
Okay. Then I'll hold my utility question.
Yeah, I'll just hold
and then
that.
The other question is, how does HUD define utilities? Because there's certain places that have other charges that we wouldn't normally see as utilities, but are utilities for units.
Okay, well, make sure, if it's not covered, just ask again, and we'll go over it.
Okay.
Okay, great.
All right, any other questions? Okay, good.
Nope, that should be it.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we're going to get into that tenant rent and occupancy charge calculations. First, it's just good to give an overview of the terminology that we'll be using. So for rental assistance, the term for charging a program participant rent would be the tenant rent. And again, this is required for rental assistance, and the income that you're going to use to determine whether you're going to charge the highest of the 30% or the 10% is going to be based on the Part 5 calculation. With leasing, the term that you're going to use is occupancy charge. And again, this is optional for leasing recipients. They don't have to charge an occupancy charge. If they do, though, they have to make sure that they do those same calculations and just ensure that they are charging no more than those three. And Part 5 is used there too. So you're using Part 5 to determine the income, and then for rental assistance, you're choosing the highest of the three, and for leasing, you're just ensuring that whatever you're charging is no more than the highest of those three. So here's some distinctions about when you need to calculate the tenant contribution. For both leasing and rental assistance, you're going to be doing that initially. If you are under leasing, make that calculation. For rental assistance, you actually have to do it annually, and then on an interim basis as income changes. But it isn't clear about whether or not recipients can choose to only do make a change in the rent share with decreases in income, and what the requirement is to be done initially, and then on an interim basis if requested by the program participant. So it doesn't actually require, the rule doesn't require that it be done. Participants know when they do need to be informing them about changes in income or in family composition. So for calculating the participant share, whether it's leasing or rental assistance, and then based on those three figures, for rental assistance, you have to charge the highest. For leasing, you can, again, choose to impose an occupancy charge, and if so, it needs to be no more than the highest of those three calculations. And again, for leasing, they have to make sure that whatever, if they are charging an occupancy charge, they have to have a clear and consistent policy for how they come about those calculations, and that it's fair for all program participants. Jane's income, $78 is 30%. There's not a welfare rent, which is going to be, there's not many states that have a welfare rent, so more often than not, it's going to be those first two calculations that matter. In rental assistance, you would have to charge $78 because that is the highest. In leasing, they have the option, but they can charge no more than the $78. And just a special note on the earned income disregard. The earned income disregard is for program participants with disabilities that gain earnings throughout their time in the program. And essentially, what needs to be done there is that in the first 12 months of their increased earnings, 100% of those increased earnings need to be disallowed. And then in the second year of those increased earnings, 50% of those earnings need to be disregarded in calculating the rent. Now, the earned income disregard has applied to SHP, so this should be nothing new for those former SHP recipients that are now leasing recipients. But for shelter plus care, this wasn't applicable. So this is going to be a change because the preamble of the rule does outline that the EID is going to apply to the CoC program, and HUD is actually currently in the process of finalizing these conforming amendments that's basically going to state that the EID does apply to the CoC program. So again, the key difference there, it shouldn't be a change for former SHP recipients, but it may be something new for shelter plus care recipients. And there are trainings online that people should really look at because it's a very complicated calculation, and it's not necessarily a 2-year period. It could go over time. It doesn't have to be consecutive months. So it can get very complicated. So definitely suggest to recipients that they should look at the resources that are available on OneCPD. Some other key differences around the tenant contribution as far as rent calculations go is that utility allowances are not really discussed in the rule, and we'll talk about this more later. And there's some minimum rent requirements that are outlined in the CPD Notice 9603. Those aren't talked about in the interim rule. So there are some areas that still need additional guidance for, and the CPD Notice 9603, that provided very clear guidance for legacy homeless assistance program. So it applied to SHP, it applied to shelter care, and it really clearly outlines how the rent calculation needs to work and how utility allowances are taken into account and how they are paid for. So HUD does anticipate that they're going to be updating that notice in the coming months to sort of take into account what this means for the CoC program going forward. And 9603 also outlines sort of areas around allowable program fees, and since those are no longer allowable in the new program, there may be some additional guidance around that. Does anyone have any questions about that? Again, we're going to be going into utilities next, so anything around that we'll be covering. So the EID will apply to the CoC program. Sorry, Margaret, I just saw your question. Any other questions? Okay, I'm just going to go forward with utilities
Liz,
then.
Just when you get to the utilities, it's Emily. I was looking up where HUD defines what utilities are to answer Colleen's question, and I tried to put in the answer thing, but I didn't get all of it in there. But because I know we don't cover that, so just
well, you can go
Liz
ahead.
Liz will cover how utilities are calculated, but the utility allowance section of the Section 8 rules at 24 CFR 982.517, which is all about utility allowances, is where they talk about what's included and what's not included. However, I know that there's some geographic differences. For example, in the South, air condition is included. So it's, in all cases, it's a housing authority's utility allowance that is used in these projects. So the Housing Authority's utility allowance had to have been approved by HUD, so whatever utilities are included or not included in that utility allowance are already HUD approved. I don't know if that answers your question, Colleen. And you're muted probably, so. Yes, she said yes. Okay. All right, Liz, take it away.
Okay. Okay, utilities. So these are a big issue, and I'll just say right now there's still a lot of gray area that still, questions out there that we don't have answers to. But utilities do play a major role in both leasing and rental assistance. They factor into the allowable amount that you can pay for rent, and they also factor into how much a participant is going to pay for rent or an occupancy charge. And again, I just want to make the distinction when we're talking about FMR. FMR assumes the inclusion of utilities. So when you're looking at FMR and you're comparing it to what you're actually paying for leasing, you want to make sure that you'll understand that the FMR is assuming that utilities are included. Okay, so if utilities are included in the contract rent, projects can use rental assistance funds to cover the cost of the rent, and they can be over the FMR because in rental assistance, you can go over the FMR, even though, again, you want to make sure that as a recipient, you're watching, what you're budgeting for, because even though you can go above it, you're not necessarily going to get paid for that. So where utilities are included, you can use rental assistance funds to cover the rent. The same with leasing. You can use leasing funds to cover the cost of rent, including utilities up to the FMR. But in either case, the rent has to be reasonable. So again, this slide is essentially just saying that, you can use rental assistance to pay rent, and you can use leasing funds to pay rent where utilities are included. Just wanted to highlight some key terms that we're going to be using. Gross rent is the cost of rent plus utilities, and the contract rent is the actual amount that the landlord collects. So if utilities are included, the contract rent would equal the gross rent, but where utilities are not included, the gross rent would be higher than the contract rent. So in the interim rule, 578.77, that's where it outlines how, what calculations are required for leasing and rental assistance for rent or occupancy charges. It doesn't say anything about a utility allowance. And if you go to that 40 Act, I can't remember the regulation, where it outlines the rent charge for rental assistance, that doesn't talk anything about utility allowances. So the question sort of is out there, does the utility allowance apply to the CoC program? And again, under that CPD notice 9603, it clearly outlined for shelter plus care and for SHP that a utility allowance did need to be taken into account, and that it was part of the calculation that you're doing for an occupancy charge or for rent. But it doesn't actually say in the interim rule anything about a utility allowance for rental assistance or leasing. And in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, that outlines that there needs to be a utility allowance and that you need to take whatever the tenant payment is and subtract the utility allowance, and then that is how you determine what a tenant is actually paying. So again, there is still guidance forthcoming on this, but I do know on the AAQs, we have been saying, you need to take into account utilities in the calculation of rent or an occupancy charge. It's just that it's not actually outlined anywhere, but it is what was being done in those former SHP and shelter plus care programs. For rapid rehousing, there actually is something in the rule related to rapid rehousing stating that the utility allowance does need to be provided. But the interesting thing here is that rapid rehousing is completely different anyhow with the way rent is calculated. Recipients have an option of doing, they aren't beholden to those rent calculations or the occupancy charge calculations. They could charge more or less. But even if they're doing that, they still have to account for utility allowance if the tenant is responsible. And one thing I should just outline here around utilities is that, whether it's leasing or rental assistance, with leasing, the recipient, the utilities may be in the recipient's name if they're not included in the lease, or the recipient, if there's a unit that they're leasing that doesn't include utilities, they could put the utilities in their name, or they could then put the burden on the tenant to be responsible for the utilities. And in rental assistance, since in most of those cases the lease is going to be directly with the tenant, except for outside the sponsor base, the utilities would then be in the tenant's name. So when we're looking at what a utility allowance is, every local PHA has to establish and maintain a utility allowance schedule. The main exceptions are telephone, cable, and other amenities like that. Internet is probably one that should be on there. Those aren't necessarily utility allowances, but I do think, as Emily mentioned, that certain PHAs in their local area will have certain utilities outlined in their schedule that are sort of specific to that area. Even trash collection, I know, is on some utility allowances. There's a lot of different nuances in those. So recipients really need to go to their local PHA to see, to get that utility allowance, and it is required to be updated annually, and to consider all different types of combinations of tenant-paid utilities and unit types. So you may have different unit structures that are outlined. So when you look at the utility allowance, you're going to line up that unit type that the tenant is either interested in or that you're leasing as a leasing recipient to figure out what that utility allowance needs to be. So here is just a sample utility allowance for the type of tenant-paid utility. So again, there's a bunch of different types of utilities: oil, gas, electricity for lights, hot water, electric hot water. So this is for a one-bedroom duplex, and you'll see that there's $40 in electric heat and $20 for lights, and $20 for electric hot water. So the total calculation there is $80. That would be what the utility allowance would be. So when we're talking about where the tenant is responsible for these, Whether it's leasing or rental assistance, you would do that calculation of 30%, 10%, or the welfare rent, and you come up with a figure, and in this case, it's $150. You would then look at what they're responsible for utilities, do the utility allowance calculation as far as adding everything up. You take that $80 that we just did on the previous slide, and you subtract it from the tenant rent or occupancy charge that you calculated, and then the final tenant contribution is going to be $70. So the difference between their share that you calculated and what they were responsible for utilities. So that is actually what the tenant would be paying either to a recipient if it's leased housing, or what they'd be paying directly to a property owner in rental assistance, TBRA, for example. So this next slide here just sort of shows what the impact of utility allowance looks like on rent and the rental assistance payment. In this case, the contract rent is the same for both units, but the distinction is that utilities are not included in number 1, and they are included in unit 2. And you'll see that where there are not utilities included, there's an allowance for the paid utilities of $80, and then the tenant share of rent is then $70 in unit 1, whereas it's still $150 in unit 2 because they don't get any utility allowance. And the difference there in how much you're paying in rental assistance or leasing is that the subsidy payment is going to actually be higher where you're providing a utility allowance because it gets directly deducted from that tenant share, so they're ultimately paying less, so then the subsidy needs to be higher. So with rental assistance, again, the FMR assumes the inclusion of utilities. With rental assistance, the FMR doesn't apply, so, but rent reasonableness does. So you want to make sure that whatever you're providing in rental assistance, that it's reasonable minus the tenant contribution where utilities are included. If utilities are not included, participants can be required to pay for them, and you would provide a utility allowance. For leasing, FMR does apply when we're talking about leasing individual units. So if the rent includes utilities, leasing funds could pay up to the entire rent up to the FMR. And in addition to this, they can choose to charge an occupancy charge. But if the rent doesn't include utilities, the leasing funds cannot be used to pay for utilities. So that's a key distinction there. Participants can be required to pay. So again, recipients can take the, if they're responsible in the lease that they have directly with the property owner, they can then turn around and in the sublease or occupancy agreement that they have with the participant, they can make them responsible for those utilities. But a utility allowance should still be provided when calculating those occupancy charges for the tenant. And then if they are choosing, for example, to keep the utilities in their name, they can use operating, if they have an operating budget line item, they can use an operating fund to pay for utilities. They cannot use leasing funds, but they could use an operating, if they have an operating budget, they can use those funds to pay for utilities. So some of the nuanced issues around this are with sponsor-based, can recipients put the utilities in their name and then use rental assistance funds to pay for these costs? Because unlike with leasing, rental assistance recipients are not able to combine operating and rental assistance in the same structure or unit. So they don't really have the same option as a leasing recipient does as far as keeping the utilities in their name and then using operating funds to cover those costs. So this is a really, it's an important question because in a lot of in sponsor-based rental assistance, it's not uncommon for them to have the utilities in their name because oftentimes participants may have poor credit, they may have delinquent utility bills that they can't even turn the utilities on, so they're not even able to open an account.
So this question, is still with HUD and, the determining whether or not how basically sponsor-based recipients would be able to pay for those utilities. In leasing, again, if the utilities are not included in the rent and the tenant is responsible for paying these costs, would the recipient have to impose an occupancy charge and then take a utility allowance into question? This question actually came up on an AAQ where someone was asking, do we have to charge, can we just put the utilities in the tenant's name and not charge anything? And it's an interesting question because if the tenant's responsible for all these different kinds of utilities, especially in any kind of drastic climate, they could have very high utility costs that could become unaffordable. And if you're not doing the occupancy charge and then taking utility allowance into calculation, it could end up being not an affordable thing for the tenant. So that's still a question that remains to be seen. For leasing, there's a question of whether or not program income could be used to pay the utilities that are not included in the lease. And if this is allowable, whether or not the costs need to be broken out by each participant, by unit, or can they just sort of have one pool of money and they're just paying the utility bills. And that the same thing goes for if the leasing recipient has an operating budget line item and they're deciding to not put utilities in the tenant's name and they're going to keep the utilities in their name, and they're using operating funds, do they have the responsibility to be tracking the different utility expenditures to make sure that the rent plus the utilities doesn't go over the FMR? So again, that question is still outstanding. An even bigger question for both rental assistance and leasing are those cases where you do the tenant rent or occupancy charge calculation, you take into account a utility allowance for tenant paid utilities, and you end up coming up with a negative amount. So their income is so low and whatever the calculation is so low, and the utilities they are paying for are higher, that you come up with a negative number. So in this case, the tenant rent is $50. The allowance that you determine based on that utility schedule is $80, and there's a difference of a negative $30. How does that money get paid? So for rental assistance, the question is if the utility allowance is more than the participant's share, can projects pay the participant the difference? In Section 8, in other HUD programs, they do make payments to participants or make payments directly to a utility company where there is a negative UF, as they call it, utility assistance payment. Where that exists in other HUD programs, they actually send a check either to the participant directly or to whatever that utility company is that the tenant has those utilities responsible for. So the question remains, how are projects going to be, how they're going to pay for it, what funds can they use to pay for that, and if they can pay for it, do they have to pay the utility company directly or can they pay the participant directly? So these are still questions that exist. For leasing recipients, it's very clear that leasing funds cannot be used to pay for utilities. Projects could use that operating budget line item. If they're an SSO, they can also use their supportive service budget to pay for utilities. All right, are there questions on that?
Or on anything? We're at the end of our large amount of information, so if you have questions about anything. I've been, maybe Sharon, do you want to ask, Sharon Price, do you want to ask HUD about the leasing versus sponsor-based? I was just giving my opinion.
Okay, hang tight one quick second. I'll go ahead and unmute you, Sharon. Okay, Sharon, you should be all set in case you want to ask a question.
Great. I just was being difficult and asking. It just seems like a complicating factor to have the leasing versus rental assistance. I mean, we've been working with the city where it's just confusing for the recipients, subrecipients, and if you can already have, I was asking why have these two different categories when you can do the same thing under rental assistance that you can do under leasing. It just seems to cause a lot of confusion. So I do understand that they were thinking about the legacy programs or whatever we're calling them, but the rationale seems like they haven't talked it through very well. So I don't think it's not like they're changing it, so I don't know that it's necessarily to answer it. But
Colleen, did you get all your questions answered about the utilities? Because I know we had said.
Fine.
I just you had I know that Liz said we're going to get to utilities. So whether leasing funds can pay for rent and utilities as long as under FMR, or do they need other funds?
Right. So you can't use leasing. You can use operating.
No. Yes.
Right.
And a lot of programs.
That was my only other question.
Okay.
You can't use rental assistance to pay any kind of utility.
Well, it's included in the rental calculation.
Well, no, if it's included in the rent, yes. But I mean, if it's outside of the rent, you can't use any kind of rental assistance to pay for utilities.
Well, I hedge because if there's a negative utility assistance payment, you can pay that directly to a utility company on behalf of a participant. That's the only situation where you'd be doing that.
Okay. Yep. I just wanted to get full clarification around those two things. Okay.
Okay. And
right,
a lot
but
of
it's not. I'm sorry, but Emily, it's not clear yet whether or not you can actually use rental assistance to do that.
Right.
Right.
A lot of folks are also, as they're transitioning, working with the field offices around this utility issue, because they didn't have an operating line item if they had leasing. So they're in their technical submission, they're working with the field offices to create one because they want to cover the utilities.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of the questions came in. If people who didn't have operating and just had leasing, and could they still cover the utilities? As long as it was under the FMR. But yeah, okay, thank you.
Margaret, you have a question about negative payment? Can we unmute Margaret?
Yeah, Emily, so if with the calculation of the utility allowance you have that negative payment, so how does the landlord get their money, the full payment? They're not going to get any portion from the tenant.
Oh, they'll get the full subsidy. They don't get a tenant portion, but they get paid. The landlord gets the full subsidy, and then there's a utility in addition. There's a negative utility allowance payment that needs to be paid somewhere. We're just not sure where yet. So the landlord always gets paid. It's just out of which funds. So that's a question, because you can't use leasing funds. You'd have to if there is a negative payment. So you'd use your leasing funds to pay. You'd use your rent. Let's do rental assistance. You'd use the rental assistance to pay, if you're allowed, to pay for the full rent for the it would be the contract rent because the utilities are not included. And then in addition, you would have a negative UAP, a negative utility assistance payment that would need to be paid someplace.
Okay.
So it's actually, you'd be using more, like if it was $500 for the contract rent, you'd be using $550, let's say, or $525.
Right.
Liz, is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Brooke is saying the other option is that the tenant remains responsible, but then that person's share would exceed the allowable tenant contribution. Yes, that you can't charge a person more because of their tenant contribution, but they can, if it's a tenant. Actually, Brooke, I'm not getting what you're saying now that I'm looking at it. Can you unmute Brooke for a sec, please?
Yep, hang tight 1 second.
Thanks, Natalie. Okay.
Yep, sorry.
So I was just saying, I think actually the status quo, right, the situation that we're in right now is the tenant, it's not that the landlord is getting that money, depending on the scenario, but presumably this is one where the tenant is paying utilities directly. So the landlord's getting all of its subsidy, the utilities are getting all of their subsidy, but the tenant is overpaying. So at the moment, it's actually probably the tenant who's experiencing the loss, and that's where the noncompliance issue comes in.
Right. But then
the tenant
the issue
is
how do you pay the tenant? How do you pay
No,
them
right,
back?
right. I know. That's the issue is how do you pay them back, but in the absence of clarification, it's not that the utility company or the landlord is not getting its money, it's that the tenant isn't getting its money.
Right.
His or her money.
Or the
And
program.
and just so you guys are clear, in both Shelter Plus Care and SHP, there was guidance saying, and Section 8, there's guidance saying you can pay the tenant back on a negative UAP, negative utility assistance payment. The issue becomes not in the rules, but in the financial management, I don't know if it's OMB or A133. One of the fund regulations that were covered under the financial management session says that you need to be able to track that money expended is used for eligible costs. So if you give this money to the tenant, you have no way of tracking that they paid the utility company with it. And that's what this bumps up against.
Emma, it looks like Crystal also has her hand raised. So I'm just, Crystal, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you as well in case you've got a question that you want to ask the group.
Okay. On the utility allowances, I don't know if you all have talked about or there's been any guidance on when you go beyond the utility allowances, because utility allowances are just set up as a general rule within each community based on, local standards. But often the actual costs for the utilities end up being higher than what the utility allowance calls for, which is something that needs to be an additional out-of-pocket cost for the tenant. And in cases where you've got zero-income people or very, very low-income people, that becomes a program administration problem if they're unable to make those payments.
So I think, the line on the other HUD programs was always that, one, the utility allowance, yes, it's based on average costs across the geographic area, but that it's updated every year. So if it was it's not a static figure. But the line has always kind of been that is actually more of a case management tenant adjustment and residential, housing stabilization issue. And that's actually why many, under leasing, many agencies want to put the utilities, want to have sort of master control of all the utilities so that they control the heat, and how much heat is used. But the line has always been for most of the housing programs that, if they go over, then they're not getting paid for. In Section 8, you go over, you have to pay the rest of the utility cost, and I think this is unique because we serve people who have very little income. Do other folks want to chime in what they've heard?
Emily, I agree with you on that, and I would just say that that's how it was operating under Shelter Plus Care and SHP. You just gave the utility allowance that was taken from the schedule, and tenants weren't being provided any additional, unless it was non-McKinney funds. If they had another source that they could assist the person with, they could do that, but you couldn't give them any additional amount beyond the utility allowance.
And I totally agree with that. This is Crystal. And we've dealt with that with other programs, but I'm just saying that is the type of question that comes up a lot from grantees under these kinds of rental assistance programs. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Right, and that's even one of those nuanced issues that we were talking about, where the leasing recipients use operating costs to pay for utilities if they keep them in their name, whether or not they actually have to track to make sure that overall over the course of the year that they're actually not going above that utility allowance. So
and
that's
I think,
a question.
And I think, there was some question about when you're collecting an occupancy charge from folks, what you can do with that funds if you were not giving the tenant a utility allowance. Is this something, how you deal, that becomes program income. Is that something you can cover utilities with? So I think there's been some questions about sort of these money that's flowing around, how it can be used. But you're right, Crystal. I think that we've heard that. I've definitely heard that question.
Thanks.
So I recognize we're late. We're running late, so I don't know if folks want to stay on or Liz, do you want to can you advance it to the next slide? I think
Yeah, I think I'm going to suggest that we wrap up, and if you've got other questions, that maybe email them to Emily or Liz or myself, and we can see about answering them for the next time. I do want to remind you that the audio file of this session will be on SharePoint along with the first session. That the materials for today are for internal purposes. I think they're really useful and have a lot of good information, but they're for internal uses only. There are materials from your reading and resource list and materials that are already posted on onecpd.info, and you should consider using those for TA instead. One note is that there is guidance on HUD's thinking about program income. We talked about that. It is in the Thorny Issues document that you got. So I recommend that you look at that. It's a good overview of what HUD is thinking right now. The next session, Continuum of Care Program Grant Administration, will be December 20th from 10:30 to 12:30. The reading resource list and registration information will go out probably on Monday. And so if you look at the next couple of slides, we've shown you the additional resources, and the last slide is, again, the schedule of sessions. Note that the December 20th session will be the last one for this year, and then we have 3 sessions scheduled for January, 2 for February, and 1 for March. So that concludes this session.
Jill,
Yes.
Tiffany wanted folks, if you have any other comments about the negative utility allowance issues, could you pass them along to Jill or myself, because they're discussing that a lot internally and going back and forth to better frame the conversation. And Piper wanted to know if the materials will be on SharePoint or the new Dropbox.
Oh, good question. We'll let you know about that.
Yeah, and one quick second.
SharePoint, but I don't know if we've switched that.
Yeah. Okay, and Mike Lindsay, you got your hand raised, so I'll just go ahead and unmute you in case you had a final question or thought. So go ahead, Mike.
Sorry about that. I think I just accidentally hit the button. I'm okay. Thanks.
He was trying to get off.
I do want to thank Emily and Liz for all the materials, and Susanna and Tiffany for all of their help today, and Natalie for all of the logistical help. So thank you, and have a good week, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.